Hello and welcome to a video that we've been working on for ages. I say ages and I mean that because this is actually the third attempt at this video because the first two attempts have all gone wrong. We're going to be making a video today on panel lining and pin washing, which is something that a few people have asked me about, and I just wanted to show you a couple of ways that you can do it using a few different products that people often like to use. So I've got here a few of the common kind of products to do it with. So I've got some Nuln Oil, this is the new one, some contrast paint. This is an enamel panel liner from AK Interactive. Then I've got some oil paint. This is just Winsor & Newton Artists oil paint. And something from a company called Ammo by MIG. And this is an oil brusher. Now this is like a pre-diluted oil paint. And I really like these, which is a bit of a spoiler alert. And I just want to show you sort of some of the differences in the finish. But before I spend too much time on that, let me introduce you to our model for this evening. So forgive the glare a little bit, but all I've done with these is I've sprayed them all. These are just Necrom underbases, and I've sprayed them all with bolt gun metal because one of the most common things that people try and do is on metallics. So before we go too much further, I wanted to show you the difference between these different materials. So we're going to start off with the different types of paint, and we're going to start off with a wash. Now this is literally just some Nuln Oil, not that one, some Nuln Oil. I'm going to give it a good shake. And I'm going to put this straight on so you can see how it will react. So I've got a normal brush. This is just a large brush. And we're going to slot this onto our model. And let me see if I can just zoom in a little bit. Get a slightly better view. So this bottom left-hand corner, we're going to use our wash on. And I'm just placing it. Might help if there was some on my brush. Onto the model, and you can sort of see it spreading along this line. And sort of kind of following along. Now, the thing about a wash is that it's a very, very thin paint. And if I just put a big blob on there, you can sort of see it move around, and we just sort of brush it into the recesses. I'm really blobbing it on here. And if you're feeling fancy, you can then move it around and try and clean it up. So we just brush that into all the different bits. Most people are pretty familiar with washes, and what it does is it just seeps into all the cracks, seeps into all the other little lines, and it gives a little bit of definition. So we're going to be a bit fancy, and we're going to take off some of the excess, because I don't really want it pooling. I don't want any of these flat areas. Now this new Nuln Oil is a bit better than the old one for this, but we don't want any real pools, so let's just pull that away. That up. So that's our wash. Now another one that people often use for this is contrast paint. Now contrast paint is an interesting one. It does work quite well for doing the same sort of technique, but I often find that it works a little bit better if you dilute it a little bit. So I'm going to start off with it undiluted. I'm going to do exactly the same. I'm just going to dot it on, and we're going to see how that sort of spreads around the model. And as you can see with contrast paint, the answer is it doesn't very much. Now you can just dab it on like that, and then you can use your brush to kind of clean it up. And that works fine, but I think it works a little better if you dilute it. Now you can dilute it with water, or you can do what I'm doing here, which is just use a normal kind of acrylic medium, or this is an airbrush thinner. So I'm going to put a little bit of that thinner on there, and then a good dollop of the contrast paint. So this is the new Black Legion. Quite a bit of this. I don't want to go crazy, so I'm just gonna, there you go. So you can sort of see the kind of ratio that we're going for. It's not quite 50-50. Very slightly more thinner to contrast paint. And we'll just thin that down, and then we'll use the same thing, and you should see that it just goes on a little bit easier, and it's a little bit easier to clean up. Clean that up just with my brush. That. And all these contrast paints work. I've just gone with this black Templar because it's quite similar to the other colours that we're using today, but any of them work. I mean, if I grab out a random one, this is one that I quite like using quite a lot. This is Cygor Brown, and I use this on my Blood Angels. Go straight from the pot again. It's not quite as strong a colour as the black, so I find that it goes on a little bit easier. Gives a little bit of a thinner approach. So we're just going around and we're just painting in all these and cleaning up as we go along. Now you can see with this, it doesn't flow quite as nicely. You can mix it with the thinner and it flows a little better, but it's still quite viscous. But it's readily available and it's everywhere. And you can sort of see how this one's drying now and it's beginning to look quite good. Now, a couple of products that I did want to show you are the enamel washes. So for this, I'm using an old paintbrush. Well, actually, I say an old one. It's quite a new one, but it's one of the Citadel starter brushes. So we don't care what happens to that. And this is our panel liner. Now, this is a product that's designed to do this with. So it's going to behave in a slightly different way. If I just carefully take some of this product out, and then when I dab this on here, you'll see that it kind of spreads along the lines. So I just dot that on, and you can see it kind of spread out, fill in the different cracks and crevices, and it'll just get wicked around by capillary action. And then I can, let's do that. And I can wick away any excess because we don't really want it pooling. And you can sort of see just how easily that this sort of just flowed straight into the cracks and crevices and gave us a very nice finish. It's much, much easier. I just had to touch it to the surface and it spread all the way along. Now, the last two are ones that I get asked about the most, and these are oil paints and the oil brushes. So we'll start off with an oil paint. Now this is just standard Winsor & Newton. Now it does take a little bit more setting up because you don't want to use it straight out of the pot. But all I'm going to do is I'm just going to take a tiny bit of this paint because we're only making a little bit of this wash up. And then I'm going to make a mistake by putting that to one side and getting it damp. That was a mistake. Mustn't wash your brushes with water when you're doing this because it just won't work. And then we're going to use a tiny, tiny, tiny bit of this enamel thinner. So this is Odorless Mineral Spirits. There's loads of brands that make it. Any of them will do. I normally use Sansador by Winsor & Newton. This is the Ammo by Mig one, but only because I've got some. I'm just mixing this up into a nice thin consistency, into a nice thin wash. I'm just mixing it up with the mineral spirits. Take a bit of mixing. And you can sort of see that I'm getting a nice sort of like wash consistency up the sides here. And then we're going to do the same things we did with the enamel wash. And I'm just going to touch it to the edges. And you can actually see as I do this, the way it spreads out, very much like that enamel wash. So I just touch it in a couple of places. And you can kind of watch it spreading along the lines, filling out those gaps. Now, the thing I really like about these oil paints, as opposed to the enamel paints, is even once it's more or less dry, you can actually pretty much completely clean the oils off just using a bit more of that thinner. You can see that I've pretty much just drenched it now in these oil paints. And then I'm just going to use a Q-tip just to take away some of the excess. I don't want it anywhere that it shouldn't be. I can just clean that all up. Now you can do this with the enamel as well, but the enamel dries much faster. And once it's dry, it's more difficult to remove the enamel from the surface. Now, the last one that I wanted to show you was the oil brusher. Now, I particularly like these because they actually come Just give that a shake. With a little brush inside them. Now the idea is that you're supposed to brush this directly on the model, like this, and then use the mineral spirits directly to kind of move it around places. This is just some more of that mineral spirits, and just clean it up and just dilute that and move it around the model, which is quite nice because you can get a really clean finish very quickly. But the way that I'm rather fond of using these is actually to make up my oil washes. So if I just get the dish there and then take a little bit of this black, you can see that it's already a little bit diluted. I just put a little bit in the bottom of my dish, like so. A little drop of thinner and just thin it out just a touch. And then you can see that it should just work really well. Following that capillary action, I'm just dotting it along. And it's just filling in all of these cracks and crevices just to get us a really nice finish. Really quickly. You can use exactly the same as the oil paint. You can clean it off with more thinner. When it's dry, you can completely remove it if you want to, assuming that you've got a nice smooth base for it to go onto. So you can kind of see the way that this is reacting there. It's just moving around, and then I can take my Q-tip again and just clean off those bits there where I didn't really use it. I can get a nice clean finish that isn't going to affect the finish. It isn't going to affect the look. Now, the last thing that I wanted to show you guys before I leave this to dry is the difference between a satin and a matte object. Now, I'm going to go back here to my oil paint, which we saw wicking around earlier. Now, these bases down the bottom here, these are all gloss varnished. Now, the ones at the top here, I've done a satin varnish and a matte varnish. Now, you don't need to protect your model with a varnish before doing kinds of oils and things, but it does help if you're trying to do this kind of pin washing technique. So if I use this on the satin, which is a little bit gloss, you can still see it kind of move its way around the model, just filling in those crevices and following that nice capillary action, which is what we're looking for. Nice and quick, get a nice easy finish. Beautiful, that's what we want. And then I can clean up any spills or whatever with my Q-tip and not my finger to get a nice finish. But when we try and do exactly the same thing, exactly the same paint, exactly the same base, but with a matte finish, you don't get nearly as much of this wicking agent going on. It doesn't wick properly. And it tends to sit much more, even though it's super thin, where you place it. It also means that as I just blob loads of this in there, so it will wick a little bit, just not as well. Really, the glossier the finish, the more it does it. But the other big problem with this is that when I come to clean it up, it doesn't clean up as well. And you can see that it's darkened the surface quite significantly compared to the others. And that's because that sort of not smooth matte surface stains a lot more. So if you're going to do an all over wash, like just blobbing it all on there and then taking it off where you don't want, your matte finish is going to be much more affected than your satin or your gloss finishes, which you can get completely clean. So that's something to bear in mind as well. So we're going to leave this to dry, and then you're going to rejoin me in a little bit of time when I've been to work with the hairdryer and let this dry a little bit naturally as well. And I'll show you the finished effect. Okay, so you rejoin me with nice and dry bases. And it's interesting how they've finished off. Now you can sort of see as I sort of rotate it around, the kind of difference between the different things with it. I mean, we'll talk about the satin and the matte one first, and you can see just how much the matte finish has been stained by the oil. It's made it much, much darker. Now, if that's the look you're looking for, then that's great. But if it's not, then, and you want to be able to clean it up and you want a nice bright finish with the really distinct lines, you can sort of see the difference between that sort of standard satin finish. Now, if we come down here to see the different products we used, I think what's really interesting is actually this wash. Now, you can sort of see some staining and that around where it went in, but actually the finish is very good for what we're trying to do. Now, I would always varnish over this anyway, and that would flatten the finish. I'd never want to have glossy models because I think they're disgusting, but the gloss is just there to facilitate the wash. Now, the contrast, we've got a lot more staining, but it is very easy. And that's the kind of benefit from it. The enamel's given us a nice finish. Really, my big, I'm not going to say issue, the big decision to make with the enamel is it dries much faster than the oils, but you've got a little bit less control over cleaning it up and things. You can mop it up, but once it's dry, and that's pretty much it. Sometimes you can get it off with a little bit thinners, but I wouldn't get too excited about that. Now, the oils, as you can see, they've dried fairly nicely. And the beauty of them is, of course, that we can, even at this stage, we can start to scrub some of that off. Now, if I get some thinner here, and just dampen it down ever so slightly, you can see that I can actually scrub away that wash, even at this stage. And the same with the oil brush. You can see where I was a little bit sloppy there, and I can just go back in there now with a little bit of thinner and just tidy that up and get a nice finish, which you can't do with the other methods. Which is why it's my favourite, to be honest. The oils and the oil brushes, I don't tend to use this as it's intended with the brush itself, because I think it's just a little bit heavy-handed. I find it really great if I want to do oil streaking or something like that using the brush inbuilt, but for this kind of pin washing effect, I think it's still too thick to do so, and you're better off diluting it down a little bit. But I just thought it'd be good for you guys to see the kind of finish of what you get from each one of these different techniques, and most importantly, why we tend to gloss before we varnish, unless that's what you want. This is kind of almost like the old null-noil effect, whereas this is the new null-noil effect, because it's the new null-noil. So I hope that was really useful to you guys. If it was, and this is the sort of thing you want to see, let me know, and I'll make more of these kind of technical videos and things like that. In the meantime, remember to leave us a like if you liked it, a dislike if you didn't like it, subscribe if you haven't. But remember to do so responsibly. Make sure you're having fun with the holiday, and I'll catch you on the next one. Peace.